Hello everyone and welcome to ADGM's webcast series. Today we are here to talk about economic substance, what it is, what has triggered the UAE regulations and what it means for businesses both here in the country and internationally. This is not a webinar where we're going to talk about compliance, filings and technical detail. There will be another information session for ADGM customers on that later. I also want to make the point that what the panelists are saying today is not legal advice. We will try to reflect this area from a number of different perspectives. We'll talk about what's going on in the world. We'll discuss the UAE regime. We will discuss ADGM. We'll look at a couple of examples of particular sectors and how the rules apply there and what opportunities we might see here in the UAE as a result of changes triggered by these rules. We'll also look at migration, how to move businesses and structures from elsewhere back here, and discuss some of the merits and concerns to keep in mind in doing that. We have some excellent speakers with us today from a number of different perspectives. We have tax experts, we have lawyers, we have regulator, we have from a fiduciary services angle. I'm sure that this will be a very interesting discussion. To you panelists, I think let's treat this as a rolled up sleeves sort of discussion. Feel free to weigh in, to offer new perspectives, to disagree where you feel that that is called for. And to our audience, welcome to you as well. As always, we want to make this interactive. We need your questions and your views and perspectives for this to be a good discussion. Please post on the social media channels you're following us by. The team will make sure that we get the questions here in the studio. As I mentioned, we are not going to focus in particular on filing and compliance. Those sets of questions, we may not reflect them in the panel, but I do know that several of our panelists are very helpful and they will try to look at your questions and try to address them afterwards. To our panel now, welcome. It'd be really interesting to hear from each of you who you are and what angles and perspectives you bring into this discussion. Michael, please.
Good morning, everyone. Also from my side, I'm Michael Lane, the Managing Director of Swiss International Legal Consultants based in the ADGM. We advise private and corporate clients in setting up here in the UAE and existing clients and entities in optimizing their structure here in the UAE and the region. Of course, the new set of the economic substance rules is now a big part of the compliance of our clients, and we advise them in how to get through the pitfalls. Handing over to you, Vartika, please.
Thanks, Michael. Good morning, everybody. I'm Vartika Jain. I'm a senior manager with KPMG in the UAE. I advise a number of clients on their cross-border structuring, their global tax compliances, on international tax and transfer pricing matters, and also on the recently enacted economic substance regulations in the UAE and other countries across the world. Over to you, Tim.
Thanks very much, Vartika, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Tim Land. I am the Executive Director of Monitoring and Enforcement at the Registration Authority of ADGM, and I'm delighted to be here presenting with this panel, speaking on economic substance and the opportunities. The perspective that I'll look to bring to the discussion will be the regulatory perspective. The Registration Authority of ADGM is a regulatory authority under the UAE's ESR regulations. And so I'll be looking to cover from those aspects as well as others. So now I'll hand over to our next panelist, James.
Thanks, Tim. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm James Stahl. I'm a partner with King & Spalding, an international law firm, and I'm based here in the UAE. I regularly represent clients that are setting up investment fund structures and also represent them to make private equity and venture capital investments, primarily in the Middle East. And the clients are generally utilizing ADGM structures to do that. And Martin, I have my sleeves rolled up and ready to have the conversation today. Back to you, Martin.
Great, thank you everyone, and welcome again to you. It's going to be excellent to have all of your views weighing in on this important discussion. It's also great to see a lot of people already listening in via our various social media channels here. And again, please post questions where you hear things that interest you so we can make sure to reflect them as well. To take us through this, and this is a big topic, a big picture introduction would be very helpful, I think. What are economic substance rules and regimes? Where do they come from? How do they play around the world and for various sorts of activities? Vartika, I know this is very much your expertise. Do you want to lead off here?
Yes, thanks, Martin. Before we go on to discussing the economic substance and what it means, it is important to understand where it's come from. So the genesis of the whole economic substance regulations is the need globally for creation of more transparency and a level playing field for countries, because multinationals were perceived to be engaged in shifting profits by their activities to countries which had no or nominal taxes with very little substance. Although there are a number of unilateral measures which countries have in place, for instance, the transfer pricing regimes, the controlled foreign corporation regimes, the DAC 6 reporting requirements, the ask from these perceived tax havens was to monitor and discourage such practices. Now, the discussions first emerged in the late 90s, where the OECD came up with some guiding principles or raised some concerns, but traction happened only after the BEPS Action 5 report was released, post which there was blacklisting of certain jurisdictions, including the UAE. In terms of repercussions, well, in addition to the reputational damage, there can also be, increased scrutiny of transactions with such countries, including the UAE, denial of tax treaty benefits, and so on, and of course, decrease in the investor sentiment in these countries. What UAE started doing was it started subscribing to the international views and joined the inclusive framework, adopted certain minimum standards. We've seen that the multilateral instrument for the tax treaties have been signed already. The country-by-country reporting requirements have been introduced, and very recently, the economic substance regulations. Along with the UAE, there are other countries in the world, Cayman Islands, Jersey, Guernsey, BVI, and closer home Bahrain, which have also introduced these requirements. Now, these regulations look to target 9 geographical mobile activities, which have the potential for BEPS. OECD and EU bodies are continuously monitoring how these countries are implementing the regulations, and there was ongoing conversation, a dialogue with the OECD and EU, on the back of which UAE has recently changed certain definitions and certain other things in the ESR framework. So this is going to be evolving, and we will have to learn to adapt to this and see where it goes. But definitely it's a very positive change for an economy like UAE to bring in the monitoring and enforcement framework. Back to you, Martin.
Thank you, Bartek. And I think that leads us to the UAE, how it looks here. Tim, do you want to shed some light on this?
Yeah, sure, Martin. And that was a really great overview from Bartika. So how this works in the UAE, and what I'm going to cover off on specifically, I think, here is that the UAE's implementation of economic substance requirements is a little bit unique. The regime has all the same principles and features that you would see in other economic substance regimes, such as in Jersey and Guernsey. But the setup in terms of the different authorities involved, particularly after the enactment of amendments to the regime in August, is a little bit unique. So let me just explain that. There's effectively three different types of authorities involved in overseeing and administering the UAE's economic substance regime, or ESR. The first is the regulatory authority, and that's a combination of most of the registrars of all the different jurisdictions around the UAE, as well as the financial services regulators. They play the role of the regulatory authority. And the regulatory authority's role is to review the filings, the economic substance filings, that's the notifications and the economic substance reports that licensees need to file for accuracy, completeness, correctness, and so on. And importantly, to review whether or not a licensee that is claiming one of the exemptions has provided sufficient supporting documentation to demonstrate or satisfy that they meet that exemption. So the regulatory authorities play that role of reviewing the notifications, of conducting education and awareness raising amongst the licensees within their jurisdiction in the UAE, and working with the other authorities that I'll cover in a moment when it comes to administering the regime. So who are the other authorities quickly? Then the amendments to the regime that were enacted in August have introduced a national assessing authority, which is the Federal Tax Authority, the FTA. And the FTA's role is to review the substance returns or substance reports to make a determination on whether or not the licensees have met the substance test. Then they hand over to the competence authority for the UAE, which is the Ministry of Finance, the UAE Ministry of Finance, and there's an information sharing requirement there from the National Assessing Authority to the Ministry of Finance, particularly where an entity has been deemed to not have met the substance test. That information gets passed to the Ministry of Finance, and through the international tax treaties and methods of exchange of information with other foreign tax authorities, the Ministry of Finance will share that information internationally, which is a really important aspect of this whole regime to underpin the integrity of the regime as well. So that's what I want to cover off on for now in terms of how the UAE's regime works. I'll hand it back to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Tim and Bartik, as well. We'll no doubt have reason to return to some of the areas you've covered so far when we look at particular examples. But Tim, I think you led the discussion in the direction of the taxation landscape in which these rules apply. Michael, do you want to expand a little bit more on that? What is this overall landscape, and what other components are important when we think about economic substance?
Yes, so here I want to pick up from Tim and Vartika. The whole starting point is the profit shifting, right? International profit shifting. That was the starting point why economic substance rules have been put in place. And we all know these economic substance rules in international regime now, this is the new normal, we would say, on international level, right? Under this umbrella, nationally, the UAE has enacted the economic substance rules, right? So we have to keep in mind that the economic substance rules are national law here in the UAE. So it ends at the borders. Although being on the international umbrella, it's still national laws, right? Here, as we all know, the UAE is a no-tax jurisdiction because you have no income and no corporate taxes, except the banking and oil companies. But in principle, you don't pay any taxes here. So in the end, the pressure putting on here from outside is rather pressure on the UAE. The UAE, of course, want to comply with this regime, as Vartika said, in order not to face blacklisting or unilateral measures, right? We have to keep in mind that the UAE, when we go outside, cross-border, has in place now 115 double tax treaties. So these are treaties to evade double taxation between the UAE and a specific country, right? Having said that, we have one specific instrument, the double tax treaty, which is cross-border, and we have one instrument, these economic substance rules, which are national. And until now, the economic substance rules of the UAE are not in anyhow connected or relevant for now to the double tax treaty and the regime. I make one example. Vartika said it in the introduction. There are 9 relevant activities which the focus is on. One of those is the holding company. And when we talk of holding company, we talk only about holding companies which hold equity investments, so only shareholdings in other legal entities. So we don't talk about real estate, we don't talk about planes, we just talk about the pure equity holding. On the national level, such a holding company would fulfill the economic substance requirement of having a flexi desk or a smart desk. Because to be honest, if you're an equity holding company only, you don't need to have offices or staff. We're just sitting there 40 hours a week, staring at the wall, not any operations at all. So from an economic substance rules perspective, a holding company, pure equity holding company, can be fulfilling all requirements on the economic substance rules on national level. If the same entity, the holding company, wants to get, however, a tax residency certificate under the double tax treaty with a specific country, one of the requirements here is from the Ministry of Finance here, always under the agreement on the double tax treaty, to provide either a title deed that the company owns the real estate property or a lease contract. So here, this is a typical example where you can be fully compliant with the economic substance rules here in the UAE, while you might not be compliant to get a tax residency certificate under a specific double tax treaty. So here we have a discrepancy. We talked about it also before this webcast in how far, maybe in the future, like the fulfilling of the requirements under the economic substance rules might be a requirement to obtain such tax residency certificate. However, for now, they're not linked in the way that, like, if you have a tax residency certificate, you most likely will fulfill all the requirements on the economic substance rules. Vice versa, however, this is not the case. So this is a bit to bring in the connection between the economic substance rules and the taxation landscape cross-border under the various double tax treaties.
Good, thank you. You relate to a discussion we had here just before we went live, when several of you had a lot of opinions on this particular angle of tax residency certificate. Vartika, do you want to voice some of your views? And I also think you flagged a question here about the principal purpose test. You'd like to give some space here.
Yes, thanks, Martin. And to add to what Michael just explained in terms of how the treaties work and how the domestic legislative framework is, we can expect that in the future, the Ministry of Finance might also start looking at whether an entity, again, I'm talking from a futuristic perspective, as Michael mentioned, currently it's not the case, but in future, the ministry could ask entities to substantiate or to ask them if they are carrying on one of the 9 relevant activities, and in that case, have they met the substance test here, and only then issue the TRC. So it could become one of the conditions of issuing the certificate itself. Also, now that the UAE, along with many countries in the world, have signed the multilateral instrument, one of the minimum standards that countries have adopted is inclusion of a principal purpose test in relation to having the benefits of the treaties themselves. If there is an entity in the UAE which meets the substance tests, it might be able to satisfy that principal purpose test as well and get the treaty benefits. So again, in the context of only these 9 activities or entities which carry on one of the 9 relevant activities having enough substance in the UAE, it would act as a boost for them to get the benefits of the over 100 double tax treaties that the UAE has.
Thank you. Michael, did you want to add something again?
Yeah, here I just wanted to add one example which we encountered while advising our client. Our client has a holding company based in Dubai, fully compliant with the economic substance rules. The same company has a subsidiary in France. And here again, the French tax authorities, they did not really care about if the Dubai company is meeting the economic substance rules, but the client had to provide, in fact, a tenancy contract that here the holding company, in fact, has its own residency. Under, of course, not the tax residence certificate, but the French authorities, in order to assess if the company is real in the UAE, want to see such tenancy contracts. So once again, this is the best example in how you can be fully compliant locally, nationally, and as soon as you go into cross-border, then of course it's more the other side, which defines if you can reclaim your withholding tax. So in this case, the French tax authorities, rather than the authorities here in the UAE. So here we really have to keep in mind that on one side, we have the economic substance rules here in this country, but if it's about taxes, it's rather the other side who defines how the game is to be played.
Thank you. This is obviously a very important aspect in understanding and playing by these rules. James, you work a lot with funds, you work a lot with other asset holding structures, and these are among the relevant activities here that have been mentioned. Can you give your perspectives on how the rules apply, perhaps briefly for funds, for example, and then what you see on the market, how principals are thinking now that the rules are part of our reality?
Sure. I mean, and just to be clear, I mean, I know Vartika, Michael, Tim touched on this before. This is not an ADGM or UAE specific set of regulations. And so asset managers and private equity firms and others who are looking to set up structures, regardless of which, let's say, legitimate financial center they're going to run into economic substance rules. And I do believe that ADGM and the UAE are in line with international practices for financial centers and jurisdictions where people are looking to put these types of structures in place. So if people are on here and looking to say, well, if I go ADGM, is it going to be easier? Or, oh, that's too hard, I'm going to go somewhere else. If you're going somewhere else, you're going to, I think, from my perspective, run into issues, whether that's with your investors who are coming in and say that this vehicle doesn't work for my purposes, or when you turn around to make investments, you're going to find out that some of the countries or some of your counterparties aren't happy if you're sitting in some island in the middle of who knows where that isn't in line with international standards. So a few of the vehicles that we had discussed and that I had mentioned before, one is investment funds. And the new regulations that came out in August by the UAE made life a lot easier there, as investment funds are exempt from economic substance. That being said, investment funds tend to not exist by themselves. Normally, the groups that we're working with that are setting investment funds up want to have a management company, or want to have a general partner, or want to have some sort of other role that they're playing. And I do think with the fund manager and the asset managers and the other sort of regulated activities that would be carried out within the ADGM, that again, the ADGM is in line with international standards for those types of vehicles, and that there are clear processes in order to register and complete those. What's interesting to me in particular is the holding companies that Michael was talking about, and the SPVs that people are using in order to make investments. And we get questions all the time about, what do I need to do? Is this going to be rolled up into the fund and deemed part of the fund? Is this going to be separate? Does it work if I have an office in the UAE, but my directors are sitting in the US or somewhere else? Or they're sitting in Saudi and I'm making the investments into Saudi Arabia. How does this all work? And so I'm glad I have some of the other panelists here who may be able to help out in some of the thought processes here. But in general, what we have seen our clients do when they're making these, setting up these holding companies or setting up SPVs in order to make an investment is having the desk, the flexi desk here, so having the actual presence here, and then having directors that are resident in the UAE. I mean, there are a number of options within the ADGM as well for having the desk or having a real. I mean, to the extent I guess it somewhat depends on what the company is going to be doing to have a real desk and office space here if needed. And then also there's a number of groups that that you can outsource to here in the ADGM, whether that's corporate service providers who are providing some particular role, independent directors, groups that will come in and provide licensed individuals who will act potentially as compliance officers, things along those lines. But I'd be interested to see if the other panelists are seeing other ways that these SPVs and holding companies are meeting the...
Yeah, James, I just have an observation when it comes to
substance
investment
requirements.
James, I don't know if you can hear me, everyone, but when you think about the three elements of the substance test, the directed and managed, the SIGAs. So when it comes to investment fund management, taking the investment decisions in the UAE, and then the adequacy requirements, so incurring expenses, staff, physical office space, and so on. When you think about these three elements of the test, and the clients that you work with, James, how do you think fund managers view their ability to satisfy that with all the infrastructure that the UAE has to offer?
And sorry, Tim, I lost you there for a second. Apologies. The question is, how did the fund...
Yeah, the question was... Yeah, sure, James. The question was, with the fund managers that you work with, what's their feeling in terms of their ability to satisfy the substance test when you think about the three different elements of it, the directed and managed, incurring expenses, making investment decisions here in the UAE? How do you think they feel about that? So
in general, I'm seeing them say, we can meet these tests. We're happy to have that presence, have the individuals. ADGM, this is a pitch for ADGM, but you've given put the infrastructure in place, attracted enough other service providers and individuals and talent to the ADGM that we can hire people, we can have substance sitting within the jurisdiction, and that we can meet the tests. And this is... I have found that for most of them, found this to be relatively straightforward and easy process to meet the requirements.
This is an interesting angle, perhaps, of the tools available. For example, the option to outsource certain function that you both touch upon now. Michael, is that something you want to expand a little bit on, the role of this opportunity, how popular it is, and perhaps also if that over time can mean an advantage for an economy like the UAE, vis-a-vis the traditional offshore havens where there will be a limited number of corporate service providers available, for example, to deal with their large numbers of passive companies today.
So here, picking up on Tim and James, it's like all the tests, the threefold test you have to pass in order to be compliant with economic substance rules. You can basically outsource everything except the management and director being here in the UAE. So in fact, you need to have the resolutions, the meetings here in the UAE. The rest you can outsource. That means you can outsource the office you're in, you can rent it, you can outsource your staff. When we think of another relevant activity as an example, a distribution service center where you have some sort of management function, you don't need to do the manager or the consulting yourself. When we think of a holding company who is also managing their subsidiaries, you would not be a pure holding, but would fall into another relevant activity. So you could outsource all these matters. And of course, you have a variety of entities. Is it be lawyers? Is it service providers who already have set up in the ADGM, who could, in the beginning, if you want to set up here in the ADGM or the UAE, support all these matters in order for you to be compliant with the economic substance rules. However, it is all around the world, it's the same, that like the management needs to be in the UAE, except here, Vartika, you correct me if I'm wrong, the holding company doesn't need to fulfill this requirement. But all the others, you need to sit here in the UAE. And in fact, because it's about profit shifting, all in all, you need to show that you have adequate expenses in relation to what you make in money out of these seagulls, right? That's the whole purpose. In the end, they want to see that you don't just invoice and make a nice profit, but they want to see that you actually have expenses. If you have salary expenses doing it yourself, or you have third-party expenses when you basically hire or a third party. So here I see this is for both ends benefit, right? For example, if you have an entity who sits currently in the BVI or in Cayman or the Seychelles, there are very nice islands, but I'm sure you cannot just get an office there that easy. So for these entities, in order to put substance on, the UAE might be the place to go, because here you have the infrastructure, you have the established partners. Here you can set up to become fully compliant to the economic substance rule. So here I see a benefit for the country in attracting new players, and also for the companies and entities who have established here in advising those new players here in the region.
Thank you. Vartika, I believe you had something you wanted to add here.
Yes, so Michael, on the holding companies point, yes, there are reduced substance requirements for holding companies. They only need to meet the adequate employees and premises test, and also to meet their other obligations under the applicable laws. For other types of companies, also, again, direction and management tests, as you rightly pointed out, it cannot be outsourced. The meetings should happen here. However, there can be non-resident directors who could be coming in for those meetings. So that's a good thing for many businesses who have non-resident directors who travel here to make business decisions and may be based elsewhere. Another thing is that on the reading of the regulations, we note that there have been certain mentioning of things like it needs to be adequate, it needs to be this and that, and there is no definition of what is adequate really. It is all subjective. And then the decision, the ministerial decision mentions it, that the authorities are expected to follow a strict yet pragmatic approach. So that is extremely welcoming. The intention of the regulations is not to overburden somebody, but it is just to bring about the necessary substance. So if you had to say hire just 10 employees to do your job, you don't have to do 100 to meet the substance requirements. That's not the intention. So that's what I wanted to add here, Martin.
Thank you.
Zira, from my end, I also want to say when we think about COVID now and travel restriction, so we all need to be aware that the economic substance rules have not been suspended. So for now, you still need to have the meeting in the country. So electronic meetings internationally is under the economic substance rules not possible. When we think that everyone currently is working from home, and you need to have an office for economic substance, also there might be changes in the future, will be interesting to see. And what I want to pick up on, Tim, is about the whole, like, from the authority side, the same as the CRS, like the whole economic substance regulation is foremost the self-assessment, right? Everyone needs to self-assess if I am compliant. And then down the road, maybe someone will slap your finger because from authority's point of view, for whatever reason, you're not compliant. But in the end, it's a self-assessment from each and every entity here in the UAE if they fulfill or don't fulfill the requirements. Right, Tim?
That's exactly right, Michael. And, you know, in terms of travel and in terms of offices, that's probably something that the OECD and the EU Code of Conduct Group might want to take a look at into the future. But it is a self-assessment regime, and the first step, well, the very first step is, you know, are you conducting a relevant activity? And then if you think you are do you fall within one of the exemptions? And then if you do, then you need to be able to demonstrate or satisfy that you really do fall within that exemption, because that's again really important from the regulatory authority perspective, is to maintain the integrity of the regime. You can't just claim that you're exempt when you're not. So we'll be very much, all the regulatory authorities will be checking that very closely. And then if you're not exempt, then, as you say, you need to submit your economic substance report annually and demonstrate how you have met the substance test. And that will be assessed by the National Assessing Authority with the FTA. We haven't yet had our first round of economic substance reports yet, so it's difficult to say, what that will look like. But I think that it'll be really good to get feedback and experience from after the first rounds of economic substance reports have been processed and reviewed. What comes out of that, if there's guidance and so on, keep to help and continue to give more guidance and feedback about the regulatory authority and the national assessing authority's expectations in terms of meeting substance, and in particular to Vatika's point about adequacy.
And here I also want to point out that the latest rules being enacted end of August 2020 have replaced the first set of rules, right? Nonetheless, the rules and the laws from August 2020 are in effect retrospectively as of January 1st, 2019. So there's a lot of movement, even retrospectively, for the assessment. So this will be all a very tricky issue for everyone involved, you know, to follow up and see how you actually need to fit in.
That's right. It will be tricky, but I think the main thing is for firms to identify whether or not they're subject to the regime. Do they conduct a relevant activity? And if they do, make sure that they file on time. And then depending on what's in that filing, that's when the authorities will potentially have the scope to look at taking a fair but pragmatic approach.
Good, thank you. This is very interesting. If I can rewind a little bit, Michael, you spoke of the availability of outsourcing partners as one need companies might have when they look at where to build substance. It would be interesting to hear your views on what other needs might be there, so we then can look a little bit on how UAE are meeting those needs. Are there other buckets we want to think about in this context, or, for example, James, that you see in your advisory work?
I mean, just one point, which I also maybe need to point out, is like whoever provides some sort of outsourcing service, it can of course not be that the service provider with 10 employees is basically handling, I don't know, 100 companies. So here, of course, we have also very strict rules how this outsourcing can happen. The company actually outsourcing any of these parts is in the end still liable towards the authority, that in the end the activity is conducted in the UAE, right? That the outsourcing provider has adequate employees. So in the end, they cannot just sign an agreement, say, okay, that's it, I have the agreement, like the service provider or whatever is doing all the work under the economic substance rule. So here we have to be very much aware that the burden still lies on the entity who is contracting service provider. So this is like very, very strict in the laws, that they need to have overview, they need to ensure that the activity is conducted in the UAE. So this is not just like a sidestep to circumvent the laws here. So for both ends, it's a very important point to figure out here.
Yeah, and what I've seen is probably not entirely because of the economic substance regulations, but a development of a market here for independent directors that are based here in the UAE. And I've just seen that over time as the country and the financial centers and ADGM have developed, that there are more quality individuals that understand and are willing to sit and be independent directors for funds and for other companies. And so that's an interesting development I've seen, and I think it fits in well with some of the economic substance requirements.
It's interesting you mentioned that, James, because from my perspective as well, over the last few years at ADGM, we've seen the growth in the number of corporate service providers as well, and the quality of those corporate service providers in ADGM and in the UAE as a whole. And I think economic substance is going to help drive that continued growth in that area too.
It would be interesting to speak a little bit about ADGM at this stage and how we meet the set of needs that companies have as they now might be revisiting their structures, and of course for commercial reasons as well. Before we go into what you external panelists see on the market, Tim, do you want to give an overview of what ADGM is in this context, in case we have listeners here who are not familiar with us?
Yeah, sure, man. So for those who are not familiar with ADGM, it's a financial free zone. It's one of only 2 federal financial free zones in the UAE. So it's set up under a different legal structure, and that legal structure in the ADGM in particular is a direct application of English common law, and that makes ADGM quite unique. The other thing that's unique about federal financial free zones is that we have our own courts. And so as a financial free zone, we offer obviously the ability, licenses to conduct financial services naturally, but all the professional services that go around that, consulting, auditing, accounting, legal consultancy firms and so on that support the provision of financial services. But beyond that, a wide range of non-financial services as well, not just the professional services. The physical location of ADGM is Al Marah in Abu Dhabi, in the capital of the UAE. And so the ADGM was set up by the Abu Dhabi government in 2015. So we're coming up on being about 5 years old this month, actually, from going live. Very fast growing international financial center, principles-based legislation, as I said, with a direct application of English common law. So that's what makes it attractive to foreign companies looking for a legal system that they're familiar with in terms of setting up in the region. And as I said to James's point before, over the last 5 years that ADGM has been growing, seeing an increasing number of support services providers setting up in the ADGM that complement the financial services firms that are coming to ADGM as well. Last point, I guess, would be that in terms of the registration authority, fully digital registration process that can be done online, we aim to be accessible both in the financial services regulatory authority and in the registration authority. We make a point of being accessible to our firms when they have questions and queries and so on, as part of what it means to be a part of the ADGM.
Thank you. And building on from that, then, the panelists, what do you pick up on the market? What are views on ADGM? To what extent is ADGM providing a supportive and attractive domicile for these sort of activities? And do you see an increased interest from the market now when substance criteria elsewhere in the world may make things more complex there? Vartika, do you want to start here?
Sure. So over the past couple of years, we have seen a lot of investors, asset managers looking at UAE as a jurisdiction to come to. And in particularly when we talk about where do you set up your presence, they are focused on ADGM. And, in a short span of 5 years, ADGM has come up on the world map. It's because of its processes, the legal infrastructure, of course, the courts that Tim spoke about. It puts some confidence out there, and also the infrastructure which ADGM has built in these 5 years. I think that those are the key things that we pick up from the market about ADGM.
Thank you for that, James. I noticed you nodded. Do you have something to agree or disagree on here?
Yeah, I mean, and from my perspective, I completely agree with Vartika. I mean, over a short period of time, ADGM is absolutely on the map. Early on, we of course had to explain to clients and others what ADGM was, what it meant. Now it's at the forefront of most people's mind when they're doing business in the UAE or in the wider region. So I think that is something that it's a jurisdiction that people are comfortable with, and I think for a number of people it is. I want to go to ADGM unless I can't. Because of the infrastructure and the various other support that the ADGM is providing. And again, because of the other players and other service providers and groups and investors and customers that are based there.
Good, thank you. If we take it from there then to how companies, taking your words for it now that ADGM is a appropriate and perhaps even an attractive environment to place some or all of these activities in. How can that be done? And talking in specific about migrating structures from elsewhere, there may be certain benefits to that. Michael, is that something you have perspectives on?
Yeah, migration, of course, now becoming more and more a big topic around the world. Last but not least, of course, due to the economic substance rules, right? Because as we said, it's an international regime now. You have other traditional offshore jurisdiction who might have a bit more problem. It's maybe a nice island, but it's a bit more tricky to get some substance. So why would you even consider, or what are the benefits of a company migration in general? So here I would say you keep your company track record, you keep your company history. So if you have set up in another jurisdiction, and by another jurisdiction, I mean even a jurisdiction outside the ADGM, but still in the UAE. If we take, for example, an offshore entity in RAK ICC or Jafsa, Jebel Ali, the traditional one, or if it's a company in the BVI and you have an offshore entity, you have now the possibility to move that entity, given that the activity, of course, is accepted by the ADGM, onshore to ADGM. So you have the possibility to add substance to an offshore entity by bringing the same company onshore. And if the company has been established 20 years ago, whatever, you have a track record, you have a history, you have banking relations, so you can keep all those in principle. We know how hard it is working with the banks at the moment, so that's why I say theoretically you can keep those relations. Nonetheless, you can keep your clients, you can keep your transactions, your agreements, you just move the jurisdiction, the tax jurisdiction of the entity. And as I said, the migration can be a good tool to add some substance. When we think of a broad jurisdiction, that could also mean that you want to move your entity or migrate your entity to ADGM in order to profit from 115 double tax treaties, which you might not have in the old jurisdiction. So there are a variety of reasons why you might consider migrating a company. So again, you have an extensive double tax treaty network here. You have world-class infrastructure here in Abu Dhabi. You have direct flights to anywhere in the world. You can even do US clearance at Abu Dhabi airport, I heard. That also makes it a bit easier if you fly to the US. So the variety of benefits of such a migration to Abu Dhabi and the ADGM in particular. This is, of course, as I said, with the new international standard, more and more clients, we have seen that, looking into that, because they want to keep their history, they want to keep their company as it is, but want to make it more favorable in terms of economic substance rules, in terms of the legal framework. Tim said it before, it's the English law applicable. So when we think of the Jerseys and the Guernseys of this world, you might want to remain in the same legal spectrum, right? So ADGM might be a very good option if you think about such migration. This is what we see now, accelerated, of course, because of these international standards. And ADGM is like a good destination because it's reputable. That's what I want to pick up on my colleagues from before. When you talk to abroad banks in Europe, they know what the ADGM is. You don't need to explain them anymore what the ADGM is. So it can open up or like ease up business if you consider migration, definitely.
Thank you very much for that. Not to go into too much detail, but Tim, can you give the high-level picture on how migration can be done into ADGM, and perhaps also address the situation we are in with Corona and a number of restrictions? Can it still be done, and what's done to facilitate for companies who may be looking to explore or execute this?
Yeah, sure, man. So in terms of, briefly, the process of migration, ADGM's companies regulations, our company's law provides for migration or continuation, obviously. And one of the main sort of criteria to facilitate migrations is that the company that you want to migrate into ADGM needs to be in a jurisdiction where that jurisdiction's company's law also facilitates or allows for migration. So that's the major prerequisite. Provided your company is in a jurisdiction that provides for migration, you can migrate it to ADGM. There's a number of restrictions on migration, so obvious ones like the company can't be under liquidation or administration that you're trying to migrate, obvious ones like that. But provided none of the restrictions apply, then you can apply to migrate the company into ADGM. The process, in terms of timing, depends on, because there's interaction between the registration authority in ADGM and the registrar of companies in the jurisdiction you're migrating from. So It depends on the time taken for those interactions, but generally speaking, it goes pretty smoothly. We've done quite well over 100 migrations so far into ADGM, and at the moment, I mean, moving into sort of Corona and COVID-19, the ADGM has identified very early on, and the senior leadership and management wanted to make sure that we both support existing ADGM entities as well as maintain our attractiveness for new entities that are looking to set up during this challenging time, and acted swiftly to implement a number of financial and non-financial sort of support measures. And so some of the non-financial support measures for existing firms, extensions of timeframes for doing certain filings, and some of the financial measures that have been put in place include a reduction on renewal and licensing fees. And so, for example, currently migrations, the cost of a migration has been reduced to zero. It's been made free currently until March next year, 2021. The cost of a migration is currently free. The cost of setting up a new business in ADGM is currently 50% of what it would normally be. The cost of renewing your license if you're already an ADGM entity has been reduced to being free. All of these support measures were put in place back in March when the onset of the pandemic was starting to really bite, and businesses were really starting to suffer. And we hope that that's going to play some small part in helping to support them through this difficult time.
Great, thank you very much for that, Tim, and thank you, all of the panel. We have a few minutes left before we wrap up this discussion. I want to put it to you here broadly. Are there any other perspectives you'd like to bring into the discussion, or any of the topics we touched upon so far you want to give a little bit more light? Please, let's hear from you.
I would always say the economic substance rule is a blessing or a curse, right? It's twofold. As Vartika said in the beginning, it can be a blessing because the UAE can show that they're up to an international standard now, the new international, but UAE is in line with this new standard. That's what also James pointed out in his remarks. Of course, a curse because, everyone, I guess, has enough compliance to do, so it just adds another layer. However, in the end, this can bring to the UAE, to the ADGM, to everyone involved down here, of course, new possibilities, where we can expand operations because maybe other more traditional offshore jurisdictions, other no-tax jurisdictions have a bit more struggle. So here, the UAE can pick up and play its strength, as Tim pointed out. Like, the infrastructure is here. The platform is here. The platform is known around the world. We show now, the UAE shows that they're up to the code, they're up to the international standard. This could be really a blessing to show that we're on the same boat like everyone else. And we try to make it to the best to accommodate new players and help existing players to prove that they are up to the new normal.
So completely agree with you, Michael, on this, that yes, it is indeed a blessing. It puts UAE in a better light, so to say, on the global map. And also in respect of the compliances, while there are increased compliances, of course, there are also these new exemptions which have come in for investment funds, for licensees which are tax resident outside the country, and also importantly for domestic businesses which may be carrying on one or the relevant activities, but they do not have a multinational presence at all, because these smaller groups were in fact asking these questions now and again as to why are we having to comply? We don't have any activities outside the country. What is it, do you think, that we are trying to do? So it's a very welcome set of exemptions, I would say. Again, there is also a fifth category of exemptions by which the Minister of Finance can introduce a new set of exemptions. And it might be worthwhile to exempt the entities which are taxed in the UAE, which are the foreign oil companies or branches of foreign banks that could be consider, I think. But to sum it up, yes, this is definitely a blessing. We can see a lot of investor faith and confidence coming back to UAE because of this. Let's see how this evolves further.
Thank you, James. Any last remarks?
I don't think I could have said it better than what Vartika and Michael did. And I guess to add to that, which I've said before, I do think the UAE is a good place to do business, and in particular in the ADGM for the various reasons we described here, but mainly just the infrastructure, the legal regime, and just the overall ecosystem that you've developed there. So.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Let's leave it at that then. James, thank you very much. Vartika, Michael, and Tim, excellent to have you with us. Thank you very much for all your interesting perspectives on this topic. And final thank you to you, dear audience. Please stay tuned for more ADGM webcasts in the week to come. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.